I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Bryan Langston. Now, Bryan, as you can see here, is over at Mirantis, and he's been with Mirantis for the last 6 years. And you're probably familiar with Mirantis, is a container and Kubernetes company, and they acquired a Docker Enterprise a couple of years ago and have really been building out those capabilities. Now, before Mirantis, Bryan was over at IBM and at IBM Research, where he worked on building a Linux supercomputer for web scale crawling. And he also worked on some of the earlier first-in-kind projects related to cloud computing. So I'm going to hand it over to Bryan right now to go ahead and get started. So yeah, Bryan, we see your slides here, and yeah, whenever you're ready to get into presentation mode.
Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, thanks everybody for joining. It's been a good discussion. I've had heard a lot of good content. Sounds like a lot of common commentary about the SolarWinds attacks and what do we do with all that. My agenda for today is to discuss how image registries can help avoid cyber attacks. And in doing so, I want to highlight a few characteristics of some of the more recent publicized attacks like SolarWinds, as other people have done as well, and ransomware, and what some strategies are to prevent similar attacks. I'll then talk about the concept of a secure software supply chain and the role image registries have in them. And finally, what all of the above means in terms of compliance implications. My comments today aren't going to say that if you do the things that I discuss, you won't become a victim of a similar attack. That's just not realistic. I do want to mention SolarWinds to help illustrate the importance of certain key attributes and importance of the supply chain. One big takeaway or realization about recent attacks is that many US supply chains are vulnerable for various reasons. And these vulnerabilities cause serious disruptions to many aspects of our daily lives. Protecting them ensures continuity of service, economic activity, and a host of other benefits. So next slide, about the anatomy of a SolarWinds attack. Obviously, by now, this is something you've all heard of extensively by now. This was a supply chain attack, right? What that means is the actors attacked their targets using a third party, which was SolarWinds. And that was a part, SolarWinds was a part of their target's supply chain. So the actors infiltrated SolarWinds supply chain, inserted code that once deployed by SolarWinds customers, opened up backdoors. And this Trojan horse was delivered, as we've heard, up to about 18,000 customers and affected Fortune 500 companies, US government agencies, and other targets. So given that the US Cyber Command was blindsided by the attack, it's worth asking yourself how your own organization would fare. What mechanisms are in place to mitigate impact of any attack? And not just one with the level of sophistication of SolarWinds, even less sophisticated attacks. Begs the question, how would I fare? So next slide, I want to cover some risk management strategies. And typically companies have two risk mitigation strategies. One is preventive in nature. And this is where you proactively plan for known risks, things that you know about. How do you protect known attack vectors? How do you anticipate what methodologies might be used against you? In a reaction strategy, you're responding to a detected threat, and your response might be in the form of a new tool. Maybe it's a new process, a feature, or some setting. But the third one, more frequently, and especially in light of the SolarWinds attack, since it seemed to be residing undetected for some time, is that a mitigation strategy is being used. And the key difference here is that you're starting with an assumption that a breach has already occurred. And if you assume you've already been compromised, you probably ask yourself a different set of questions compared to the other strategies, right? You might ask yourself, what's your next move? Do you focus on containment strategies that reduce the blast radius, right? What gets impacted by the attack? Do you implement more monitoring tooling? Would you use your existing tooling in a different way? What are your baselines that you're measuring, and how are you measuring against them? what are the possible mitigation strategies you can utilize? So ideally, though, a combination of all three strategies has to be used. So the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the secure software supply chain. And at Mirantis, one of our focus areas is helping our customers ship code faster, but not compromising security along the way. And one of the frameworks for doing that is what we call a secure software supply chain. What I'm showing here is a reference architecture for it that reflects our product portfolio, some of our product portfolio, and the integrations with other third-party products. One of the ideas behind a secure software supply chain is the fact that you have various segments within the supply chain that allow you to optimize the process and secure the application as it progresses along the supply chain. So various gates are defined that help ensure that the application doesn't progress or ultimately get deployed unless all conditions are met. And one of the key components to the supply chain is the container image registry. So next slide, we'll talk about 5 security pillars. Mirantis Secure Registry is one of the components, like I said, of our Mirantis cloud native platform. It has what I call 5 security pillars. There's more to it, but these are related to security specifically, or at least have more direct ties to them. These pillars are required, in my opinion, in order to fully maximize the value that an image registry can bring to your secure supply chain. You just have to be doing these things. And the first one is access control. This is enabled by user directory integration. You have to be able to have full transparency to who's doing what, to which objects in your supply chain, who is signing, who's promoting, who's sharing what images. Image scanning is also a must. Mirantis Secure Registry, which, by the way, for some of those that are listening, as the moderator mentioned, we acquired Docker Enterprise, and with it came the Docker Trusted Registry. And Mirantis Secure Registry is the continuation of that Docker Trusted Registry product, or DTR, as some people might refer to it as. So Mirantis Secure Registry supports image scanning at the binary level, and then it correlates output with a regularly updated CVE vulnerability database. Image signing is about digitally signing and verifying both the contents as well as the publisher of images. And developers and CI tools can also apply signatures so that downstream users and automation tools can also verify image authenticity before running. The 4th security pillar has to do with container lifecycle management. Container images may be lightweight, but that does not mean that you want to store every image your team or CI tool creates forever. In order to keep the newest and hopefully most updated images, you'll want to automatically clean up those images based on some policy controls, like the date of the last update or the number of recent images you want to keep. And then finally, policy management helps you streamline the development and delivery pipeline and enforce security controls. And there's 2 parts to policy management that I'd like to highlight. One is the set of policies that are provided out of the box. And these have to do with things like only promoting images that have been scanned in the past 30 days or that have been signed or approved before deployment. There are a number of predefined policies within Mirantis Secure Registry. The second part of policy management has to do with the custom policies your team will need to write that reflects your organization's security requirements. This is where you'll have to work closely with your compliance team to understand what those requirements are and how they'll be implemented in your secure supply chain. And I can't emphasize that enough. A lot of organizations struggle with that, right? Bringing in the compliance teams, operating in siloed organizations as they historically have done. So next slide talks about a FedRAMP mandate that has been recently announced. Here's one good reason for working closely with compliance teams, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So earlier this year, FedRAMP came out with 6 vulnerability scanning requirements for containers. They're all listed here on this slide. And breaking it all down, this is what it means or looks like in practice. First, you can't use general purpose images. These are ones you might find freely on the internet or that are publicly available with little known about them, right? They have to be hardened. You've got to turn off unnecessary services, remove unused utilities, etc. Basically only add what's needed. Number two is basically the equivalent of what I've been talking about regarding a secure software supply chain, and that includes a policy enforcement mechanism. Number three relates to what I mentioned about one of the 5 security pillars of an image registry. You have to be doing vulnerability scanning. One of the many enablers of ransomware attacks is the lack of rigor within some IT organizations, including lack of software patching. So performing vulnerability scanning is a precursor to patching. You have to know what it is that's being exposed or exploited. The fourth item is security sensors, and this is a broad requirement, but it includes registries. And the idea here is that there are strategically placed sensors or gates that might do something like check for performance to a specific policy. And if that performance or condition isn't being met, then cancel the deployment. Don't let it get promoted to production. The fifth point is registry monitoring. This requirement is about looking at each container image within the registry and having some kind of awareness of attributes, like whether the container has been scanned within the 30-day vulnerability scanning window. And if not, then it's flagged to prevent unauthorized deployment. There's other aspects of registry monitoring, but that's one example. The final item in FedRAMP's latest mandate has to do with asset management inventory reporting maps, and mapping those to the container lifecycle management pillar that I mentioned in the previous slide. So those are the newest requirements for any implementation of FedRAMP. In that mandate, there's a mandate to have these 6 requirements implemented by September of 2021 this year. No doubt these are partly influenced by the increase really in ransomware and other kinds of attacks that we're seeing lately. But it also emphasizes the dependency and importance of a very rigorous methodology, I guess, approach to how you implement a secure registry and what the role is within your orchestration pipeline. So Mirantis Secure Registry supports all of these requirements, by the way. So moving on to what DevSecOps and compliance means with all of this. So next slide, please. A lot of companies that I've consulted with really struggle when it comes to the security and compliance culture within an organization that's evolving towards a cloud-native future. As I mentioned earlier, many organizations have typically operated their engineering teams and security teams in separate silos. And in this cloud-native future that we're working towards, that's just not a viable working model going forward. The struggle comes in the way of development and engineering teams working independently from compliance teams, like I mentioned. So these days, DevOps and DevSecOps teams are focused pretty much on the traditional software development lifecycle, right? They're building and deploying an application. DevSecOps teams are more frequently being used to represent security best practices, but really from a perspective of verifying that the deployment of an application follows industry best practices. But compliance, on the other hand, is different. It has to do with the compliance framework, has to do with regulations, risk management, protecting the company by ensuring that the right safeguards are properly defined, properly implemented, assessed, and verified. They're all about checklists, right? Making sure processes and procedures are in place, making sure that methodologies exist and are being applied to enforce the myriad security requirements that must be satisfied. So these two teams have to work together. The compliance team needs to help influence what the DevOps and DevSecOps teams are putting into the orchestration tooling. So next slide. Drilling down into what compliance means. When it comes to compliance, one challenge that engineering teams have is understanding what certain controls mean in terms of deployment or configuration details. Perhaps you've had a similar conversation like the one I'll describe here. Compliance teams might approach engineers about their container deployment and ask them, are we compliant to NIST 853? Engineers, not knowing what NIST even means, or let alone 853, give a puzzled look on their face and they shrug their shoulders and point to various code repositories, pipelines, and say, I don't know. This is what I do. Here's where I have code. This is what I have. You tell me. The two teams don't talk the same language. So here's something that might help bridge the gap, especially as it relates to image registries and some of the more common security controls. There are something like 240 plus controls in NIST 853, which is a common control framework. If you look at the hardened image requirement I mentioned earlier about FedRAMP, there are several controls that hardened image maps to, and these are important things to be aware of that helps, again, bridge the communication barriers between engineering and compliance teams. So these mappings between what the concept is and the controls is important. And similarly, build, test, and orchestration pipeline, again, referring back to the FedRAMP mandate, the build, test, and orchestration pipeline also maps to several controls. So building this mapping for the activities and architecture that's in place with your container environment will help engineering teams understand what it is, excuse me, that the compliance teams are looking for. It enables those teams to work better, and it's much easier to show how you are compliant. This is just a small, beginning of what that mapping should look like. And then, of course, automation would be developed around that, which is another topic. So just as NIST 853 is a common control framework, NIST 800-190 is a container-specific guide. It has multiple sections on registry-related best practices. I highly recommend being familiar with what's in that guide and assessing your own environment for alignment. Also, NIST 800-210 provides guidance for cloud systems that's worth being aware of as well. So your organization has to have a way of assessing and certifying proper implementation of these and other controls. As a result, your compliance teams will need to coordinate with engineering on how those assessments will be performed. I liked how in the prior session, John mentioned make a friend, and I would definitely echo that. Make a friend with somebody in compliance. Ask how to work together, have a working session that kind of gets the beginnings of those two teams working together. Next slide, we'll talk about assessing image registries, just some ideas on what I've seen work with some customers I work with. So first of all, assessments don't come in a one-size-fits-all package. Some assessments you can highly automate, but assessments typically come in multiple forms. And what you have to do first is decide what are the settings and configurations that will be audited against, and then figure out the best way to collect that data. Unfortunately, collection is likely to be manual still for some things. Scripts could and should be written for some things, and they could be written to query your registry product for the data that you're looking for. You might want to extract what settings you have enabled by default and establish some kind of a baseline. To help support the secure by default mindset that we have at Mirantis, our secure registry product is implementing a secure read-only API that helps enable the automated extraction, collection of security-related settings. And that's just to help our customers be able to automatically and holistically gather various data points from across their cloud platform that contributes towards making certain assessments about a compliance status. So regardless of your assessment and data collection methodologies, your registry assessment will require, again, to have your DevSecOps teams working with your security PMO and compliance teams for proper implementation. Next slide. So just as we're seeing the vulnerabilities of supply chains in supply chains in the US with recent ransomware attacks, your software development supply chain is equally a critical component to your company's success, and it has to be adequately protected. Securing your image registry, again, will not solve all of your problems, but when implemented with multiple risk management strategies in mind, and again, I want to just reiterate the idea that mitigation, right? Assume that a breach has already occurred. implement your risk management strategies and deeply integrated with your orchestration pipeline to be able to achieve a secure software supply chain concept. And lastly, one reality that has been exposed with these various ransomware attacks recently is the fact that not all organizations have adequate IT and security staff. Where you have such teams, it's important that you help enable and build a culture that facilitates a closer working relationship. And that's, I know, easier said than done. But again, to reiterate John's invitation from the previous session, go make a friend with one of those teams, talk about what the assessment plan needs to be, talk about what the controls are that the compliance team needs to see implemented in the product, right, in your deployed workloads, and then figure out, how the automation can work all around your image registry. So thank you for listening. If for remaining time, I'd be happy to address any questions that come up.
All right, great. Hey, thanks a lot, Bryan. We've got some questions to discuss here. Earlier you mentioned the FedRAMP mandate, right? And there's a number of things there: hardened images, container orchestration, vulnerability scanning, and so on. Now, different organizations, hey, as an industry, we've kind of known about this software supply chain issue for a while and been doing things to improve in that area. And it's getting more headlines, as you said. But where do you see organizations kind of doing better, doing not as well in some of those different items, areas of the mandate?
Yeah, so one thing that I see a lot of companies do better is, one, having an orchestration pipeline, and two, having a complementary framework. There's different terms that I've seen different companies use, but one company, one global service provider uses the term a QA framework, right? And this QA framework is the vehicle by which they deliver some of their DevSecOps activities. Things like doing a CIS benchmark scanning. What isn't happening as well in some cases is the continuous nature of what these scans do, right? They have a framework for doing them, but identifying all the nuts and bolts, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, to get that fully integrated into a continuous assessment is one level of maturity and progression that's still being worked out across enterprises of all sizes. And then related to that, as kind of a downstream process, is how do you report the findings, right? It's one thing for that QA framework embedded and integrated with the orchestration pipeline to say, we're failing in these areas with these CIS benchmark checklist items, right? But if it's a development team that's running those scans, they get a JIRA ticket out of it, or however they're reporting those defects and managing those defects. But again, from a compliance team, how do you report that output in terms of compliance, right? Does the failure or lack of performance to a certain line item in a CIS benchmark, does that mean that you're no longer compliant to a certain control within your, name it, right, NIST 853 framework? So does that represent a risk that has to be appropriately triaged and establish some kind of mitigation plan of action, another term for that, right? How do you take this same output and interpret it to satisfy two different sets of stakeholders? That's still a very difficult and manual, laborious, and oftentimes spreadsheet-based process that needs to get improved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. On a prior slide, you mentioned the compliance team and the DevSecOps teams working together, and compliance making sure that, hey, the requirements are there. Now, in this modern cloud-first world in which we live, where things are moving faster, things are automated, we're probably all familiar with the traditional audits, point-in-time audit, manual checklists, manual documents, and so on. How do you think that the compliance side can start to adopt more of these processes to have more of a continuous audit, continuous compliance type of approach?
Yeah, I think one, that's a big question, very important, and a source of a lot of conflict, given what I said earlier about lack of these two teams working together traditionally. There's been a lot of conflict, right? Butting heads, being dragged and forced to work with each other. But one thing is, it goes back to what I mentioned a couple of slides earlier about the mapping, right? Somehow there has to be a common language. How do you map a feature to a control framework item? OSCAL is a relatively new concept created out of the NIST organization that helps standardize, right, the language that's used to express security controls and express how assessments or audits can be done. So to the degree that companies adopt something like OSCAL or some other way of mapping in a machine readable format, the relationship between container security features and implementations with control frameworks, somehow that has to happen, right? If you build your own, great. If you want to adopt OSCAL, that's great tool, great too. But somehow you have to get towards a way of representing all that information in the machine readable format. Otherwise, it's just not going to be continuous. So, so there's a lot of good tooling I could talk about regarding tooling that helps, from the OSCAL project that helps create the right schemas and data structures that allow that continuous assessment.
Great. Hey, related to the tooling, but the tooling a little bit more broadly, we know that containers are everywhere. Every cloud service provider has some set of tools. Other various CI/CD providers have their own set of tools. What else do you see out there in terms of organizations using, considering what's on their short list in terms of how they go about implementing some of these things outside of Mirantis?
Right. So yeah, it's an important piece to consider. What's the ecosystem I need to have? One thing that I hear from customers that I consult with is, how do I establish the baseline activities, right? If you look at the patterns that were used to establish the SolarWinds attacks and other ransomware, how do I detect and respond? I know that it's not enough to just run these checklists, whether it's the CIS benchmarks or whatever. That only gets you so far. So there's a lot of discussion around, what tooling and how do I integrate that? Where do I integrate that, right? In this orchestration pipeline, where does it fit in the orchestration pipeline? Or to reuse a term I just mentioned in a prior question, that QA framework, right? How do additional tools fit into the QA framework, and how do I manage the relationships, the integrations, the inputs and outputs to those things, so that I achieve, my desired outcomes.
Great. Well, I see some people might still be typing some additional questions, but so let's go ahead and transfer the conversation over to Slack. Bryan, thanks so much for a very good presentation. Let's give him a virtual round of applause.